Hey guys, welcome back to Startup Central. So I'm sure you have been reading or listening to many people talking about the dangers of the US becoming extinct or losing its value as a reserve currency. So what is the meaning of this? Why is the US the reserve currency of the world? How this changing could affect you, your economy, your country's economy, and overall how all of this would work, who is involved. So it's really important to understand all this because changes are coming and I'm going to try to explain them so you can make the best decisions. This is not a doomsday video. We're trying to explain what's going on and how you can benefit from all of this. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, guys, there are 9 questions that I will try to answer in this video. I've done a lot of research and I'm going to try to quote some places where I have gathered this information, and I'm going to try to make it as digestible as I can for anyone to understand. So I hope this video will be useful to you, and feel free to share it with people who are interested in this subject. So I'm going to share my screen because I have prepared a presentation to make this easier to understand. So let's go to the presentation. Oops, here we are. Okay, much better. Is the US dollar at risk of losing its reserve status? So that's basically the subject we are going to be talking about in this video, but I'm going to try to answer the following question. 1, what is a global reserve currency, right? We need to start from the very beginning, and that's our very beginning. 2, what are the benefits of a country having a reserve status for its currency, which currently is the US exclusive benefit. 3, why is the US dollar today a global reserve currency? Why? How did we get here? Number 4, how does the US defend their status as a reserve currency for the US dollar? 5, is the US dollar still a strong reserve currency? 6, how things are changing. Will this changing scenarios change the status of the US dollar being the strongest currency in the world? Let's explore. 7, what could affect the US dollar's reserve status? I mean, if this change is going to be coming, what are the things, what are the red herrings, the canary in the coal mine that we can look and see, oh, now we are seeing these signs, how and when this is going to be happening? So that's number 8. When could this be happening? And finally, 9, what are the consequences of the US dollar losing the global reserve status and another currency taking its place? Now, this has happened a number of times in history. So this is nothing new. We're just living through one of these biggest changes. These changes usually happen every 70 to 100 years. Before the US dollar, it was the British pound that was the reserve currency of the world. But it changed, and so we're going to be discussing this. So let's go to the first question to answer. What is a global reserve currency? So this comes from Investopedia. So 1, a reserve currency is a large amount of currency, a lot of money, being held by central banks and major financial institutions for use in international transactions. So basically, it used to be that they would hold bills and notes and all that. Now it's all digital, mostly digital, but countries will buy US dollars and keep them in their safe or digital safe. And that's basically to protect their own currency. And we're going to be exploring more, but there are a number of reasons why this happens. 2, a reserve currency reduces exchange risk since there's no need for a country to exchange its currency for reserve currency to trade. So if one currency, let's say the US dollar, is the one that is mostly accepted for trade around the world, then it benefits a country to keep the reserves in that currency. Number 3, reserve currency helps facilitate global transactions, including investments and international debt obligations. So as you may know, the IMF lends money to countries, and then the countries, once they become indebted, they need to repay their debt. And this debt is in US dollars. So they need to buy US dollars with their currency to repay that debt. And that is benefits the US dollar because currently it is the world's reserve currency. But that might change, guys. And number four, a large percentage of commodities, let's say grains, gold, silver, and all that, are priced in the reserve currency, causing countries to hold this currency to pay for these goods. So I'm sure my country, your country, will need to import things to produce or to feed people, and those are quoted usually in dollars. So your country will need dollars for that. Okay, so what are the benefits? Because a country that holds their currency as the global reserve has a number of benefits. I'm going to mention just a few of them and the most obvious. One, that country can provide a lot of liquidity for its companies. So in the case of the US, they can just turn the printer on and then they will magically create money to fund the activities of those companies. And that's why you see a lot of entrepreneurial and business activity in the US. And that is way higher than you can see in the rest of the world. Because if another country, the one that doesn't hold that status of global reserve, starts printing their money, it's going to be devaluating its currency immediately. But this doesn't happen with a currency that is held around the world as a reserve. And I'm going to explain why that is in the next minutes. Number two, imports are cheaper for US households and companies. So if your currency is the strongest in the world, then it's going to be much cheaper for you to buy those things. So if you are producing things in the US, when you import them, they're going to be cheaper. The stronger the currency, the cheaper the imports. And of course, that country, the one country that has that status, has a lot of influence around the world. We don't need to explain this further because it's pretty obvious. So why do countries hold foreign currencies in reserve? Okay, one is, as we already explained, to meet their foreign liabilities. So they have loans, the IMF lend the country money with an interest rate, and then oftentimes it's hard to repay, but they will be plugged to the cogwheel of the US dollars. So they will need to buy US dollars. And who has those US dollars? The US. All they need to do is print more and more and more of them and then loan them out to other countries. Once these countries become indebted, then they will continually, for years and years and decades and more than decades, have to repay those loans. That means that there is a lot of demand for that currency. There's a lot of demand for US dollars. So it doesn't matter if they keep printing or raising the ceiling of debt, as long, guys, because this can change, as long as other countries still demand those dollars. So that's one reason why countries hold foreign currencies in reserve. Number two, to prop up their own currencies. So we're not talking potentially about the European countries, but about other countries whose currency might be weaker. So let's say the Mexican peso, the Nigerian naira, or any other country you can think about, in Southeast Asia or elsewhere in the world. Sometimes their countries are prone to devaluation. So the more global reserves they have with that global reserve currency, the stronger their own currency becomes. And there is a mechanism of making this real. So they can buy their own currency with their reserves. And remember, guys, everything in economy is demand and supply. So the more demand there is for a currency, the higher the price it is. So even if they buy their own currency, it doesn't matter. It's demand, so they increase the demand, and then they make their own currency a little bit stronger. Not as stronger as the global reserve currency, but that helps them. So question number three, what keeps the US as a global reserve? So why hasn't this changed in decades? So let's try to answer this. In 1944, there was a meeting, and this is during World War II, at the very end, towards the very end. There was a meeting of a lot of countries, and they decided that there was a lot of instability, social instability, military instability, economical instability. Europe was torn in the World War II, same thing as some countries in Asia. So the victorious country, as we all know, was the US. They were far away from the war, and they were like the saviors, the peacemakers. And that gave them the possibility to influence and offer their own US dollar as the stability instrument of the world at that time. So during this Bretton Woods meeting, every country that was there decided that they would adopt the US dollar, then backed by gold, as a reserve for their own currencies. So they would exchange products and services denominated in US dollars. Of course, if the US dollar was backed by gold, it would be almost the same thing as exchanging or doing trade in gold. Only the difference is that exchanging gold in real gold would be too complicated. So the US decided, I'm going to hold a lot of gold and I'm going to back my US dollars with that amount of gold. So the moment you need those gold bars, you just come here to the Federal Reserve and we'll give you your gold bars back. And you give us our US dollars and we'll save them in the bank. Now, this pact was changed unilaterally by the US like 3 decades after that, but we're not going to be talking about that right now. But this is a pact that was created in 1944, and that was the moment that the US dollar became the global reserve currency. Now, the other reason, there's 2 more reasons why this happened. Some countries could not trust each other, right? So right now we see the Eurozone as stable and peaceful. But remember, guys, back then, why would France trust the German mark? And why would Germany trust the franc in France? And the same thing with other countries around the world. And we were not as globalized as we are right now. So many countries said, I don't know your currency. So imagine Burma or Saigon or all those countries that have changed names. They changed the currencies, the countries devalue. So if you were buying things or selling things, you wanted to have the trade in a currency that you can trust. So if you cannot trust the other country, the way to establish that trust is to trade in the global reserve currency. And of course, trust, as this picture says, comes with truth. And while it remained true that the US dollar was backed by gold, people trusted the US dollar as their trade currency, as their global reserve. So people started buying US dollars. In fact, many countries that had gold as a reserve sent that gold to Fort Knox in the US for their protection, and in exchange, they received US dollars. So that caused the world to become dollarized. So the dollar became the main export of the US around the world. And if you were to contract as a company or as a country debt in international markets, you would contract that in US dollars. If you were making money in dollars, that was fine. But if you were not making money in US dollars, then that would become eventually a problem. Another way the US dollar keeps this status is through banking and trade. So if you have a lot of money, you'd rather have your money in US dollars as potentially your own currency because you would need it to trade. So eventually you will have to buy and sell that currency. And you can do that at good rates as long as you have a banking account in dollars. So many companies and countries created their own bank accounts in US dollars. And that's why New York City became one of the strongest financial centers in the world because of this status. And same thing for trade, guys. So most of the trade around the world was done in US dollars. So that became one of the reasons why the US dollar is such a strong reserve currency. And another reason is before the electronic payment systems that we know now, trading in cash, dollars, bills and coins was very complicated. And if you sent gold bars in a ship and you had pirates, and I don't mean the Jack Patch, modern pirates who took control of that boat, then you lost all that money. So sometime in the 70s, the US developed an electronic payment system, which is called SWIFT. And countries saw that as a panacea. They said, wow, I no longer have to physically risk my money. I can just transfer it over the air and magically the money will be across the world. So by virtue of creating this payment system, the US gave even more importance and more solidity to the US dollar as this global reserve currency. Now, what is the importance of the petrodollar and Swift? So these are two things that make the US dollar strong and almost unbeatable. And if these two things didn't exist, the US dollar could have lost its reserve status some time ago. So let's see what's the importance. One, the petrodollar. What is the petrodollar? Well, here's the thing. A lot of oil producing countries decided or accepted trade in US dollars exclusively. They would not trade in any other currency. They would not accept gold bars and not even Bitcoin. So, as you know, the petrol is what makes the world go around, right, guys? If there's no petrol, there's no energy. Yeah, there's renewables now substituting petrol as the energy source, but still petrol moves everything. So petrol or oil, however you want to call it. Petrodollars are crude oil exports revenues that denominated in US dollars. So as we mentioned, they are traded exclusively in dollars. Society needs energy. So how are goods going to be transported around the world? Well, through boats, airplanes, trucks, and most of that uses petrol, even trains. Of course, there's the steam engine, but that wasn't used, that hasn't been used in decades. And there is electrical energy, but I would say, I don't have the exact percentage, but the majority chunk of transport happens with petrol or with oil. So society needs energy, and oil is energy. So why did oil exporters accept dollars? Well, one, the US was the leading customer. So the US said, I'm going to buy petrol from you, Saudi Arabia, from you, Venezuela, from you, Russia, Mexico, all the big producers, but I will buy it in dollars. So will you take my dollars elsewhere, or otherwise I will just buy petrol elsewhere? So countries said, yes, I'm going to use the US dollar. I trust the US dollar. I trust that I can change those US dollars for gold bars if needed. So yes, I will take your US dollars. And then we all know that the US dollar became the currency of international trade and finance back in the 1940s. So there's no reason for them not to accept dollars. But they did I wouldn't say most, a lot of big oil producers, the largest oil producers, accepted to trade oil exclusively in US dollars. And of course, that was smart by the US government because that gave their own currency strength. So, as we know, oil is energy. US dollars are traded in oil. Therefore, US dollars are energy. So, energy is, again, what makes the world move. And if you have dollars, you can make your own country become energetic. That means trade, commerce, and everything else needed in circumventing that will be done with US dollars because you need that oil. A different world would be if there was no need for oil. And then you see what the plans of some blocs that are trying to push oil down and raise alternative energies. They might not be partners with the US dollars. And I mean, I'm all fine with environmental energy. I'm just trying to point out things going on, things happening, because all of these things will play into a major change coming. Another big thing to analyze is, we just spoke about this, Swift. Before Swift, there was no electronic payment systems, so money had to be shipped physically, and that was a miss. So Swift became one of the most, if not the most important ways to enter global trade. So if your country wanted to develop and export things, then you need to be hooked to Swift. Your country needs to be hooked to Swift. Your country's bank needs to be hooked to Swift. And who decides whether that happens or not? The US government. So here are some countries on the right, the ones in red, green, except for the US, of course, that had been prevented in some fashion of trading via Swift. So if you are unhooked from Swift, then you are unhooked from global trade. So that's one of the reasons why Swift and oil are very important to keep the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Now, there's the other side of this coin. How does the US defend the status of the global reserve currency? Because there have been attempts to change this, to create a new world order where the US is no longer the reserve currency of the world. Well, the US traditionally has a number of ways to defend this status. One is sanctions, and if you've been looking at what's going on with Russia, you know how that works. Russia, you are no longer going to be able to trade with Swift. Therefore, the idea, which is not the reality, the idea is that the ruble will suffer because there will be no demand for that currency. However, some countries are more powerful than others. If this had happened to, let's say, a country in Africa that doesn't have many things to export and that are demanding around the world, they would suffer a lot. This happened to Cuba or Venezuela, although Venezuela has a lot of oil, and that's a different topic for a different day. But Russia is one of the most important energy producers of the world. They have uranium, they have gas, they have oil. So the sanctions didn't go as planned. But normally, US will use sanctions to try to make a country do its bidding or behave well. So the other way the US tries to do this is through the military. We have seen this in Libya, enacted in Venezuela. Well, not in Venezuela. Sorry about that. In Libya, in many African countries, Kuwait, Iraq. So we all know that is the last resort. We are seeing a proxy war being fought in Europe. A proxy war means that the actual powers are not fighting with each other. They're using an excuse, and you know what country is being used as an excuse right now. So the military is being sent, in this case, planes, ships, tanks are being sent to this particular country in Europe, and in an attempt to straighten up Russia. Because the sanctions didn't work how they were supposed to work. So this is the other way the US tries to keep the reserve status of the US dollar. Now, the question right now is, with all that's going on, is the US dollar still a strong reserve currency? Is it able to keep its status for long? Let's explore. One, these are the reserves of the countries around the world. Around 149 countries answered this question. What percentage of your reserves are kept in different things? So, as an average, all of these countries reported almost 60% of their reserves being held in US dollars. The next currency was euros, 20%. So that's why we see that the euro is somewhat of a strong currency as compared to other currencies. Then we have other currencies, could be anything. We have pound sterling, so that is the one from the UK. So that's another reason why the UK hasn't entirely lost its power. Funny enough, we see the yen, even though the Japanese economy is very weak, but the yen is still being used as a currency status. As a reserve. And that 3% is the yuan, the Chinese yuan, renminbi. So right now, on average, around the world, this is the status. So as you can see, the US dollar is one of the most used reserves in the world still. So currently, it's still very strong. Now, here's a list of the top 10 countries holding reserves in currency, in foreign exchange currencies. And we know that 60% of this, on average, is US dollars. So China is holding $3 billion. Then Japan is the next country. It's 1.2. Switzerland, that's $785 billion. Saudi Arabia, 486. Hong Kong, which is China again, basically it's the same thing, 437. Then we have India, South Korea, Brazil, Russia, and Singapore. So those countries are the countries that mostly hold the reserves in foreign exchange currencies, as opposed to what? As opposed to gold, as opposed to commodities. So 60% of this is US dollars. Question, guys, what happens if China, for example, and you need to add Hong Kong and China together, decides to no longer hold US dollars as a reserve? As you can see, more than half of the money of the US dollars held as currency reserves around the world are being held by China. So we know that China and Russia are, one is in a military fight with the US, the other is in an economic or mercantile war with the US. So by them working together, joining forces, and no longer keeping the US dollar as a reserve, it would cause havoc. Now, they would be doing a harakiri to their own currencies if they just dropped the US dollar and didn't have something else that is really powerful to substitute it with. So, can this happen? Let's explore. Things are changing around the world. First thing we need to know, in the past couple of weeks, China and Russia signed an agreement whereby they would trade exclusively using yuan. So this is a big step for China. China is the second most strong economy in the world, and Russia is one of the biggest producers of energy and energy commodities around the world, including uranium, if you like nuclear, including oil, gas, and all that. We've already heard in countless videos and podcasts and news reports around the world. So the fact that these two big powers are going to be trading in yuan instead of US dollars, it's a big step towards the US dollar losing that status. So the other big piece of news that was published a few days ago, guys, this is from April 4th. So the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are looking to create their own currency to replace the US dollar for trade. So if they do this, they manage to create their own currency, and it's backed by something solid, right? Because if it's not backed by anything, and this is not going to work. No one is going to be adopting this because it's going to be a currency with a lot of devaluation. But if they back it with something as strong as gold, and they talk about using commodities to back it up, then this is another danger that we need to keep our eyes on if you are doing trades in dollars, if you have savings in dollars, or if your country saves its reserves in dollars. And let me come back here. The reason why they expressed that they want to do this is because they are worried that the US could sanction them again, in the case of Russia or any other country, in the case of India and China and Brazil, I'm not sure, but mainly China and India would be worried about sanctions. So if they create their own currency, they will no longer be affected by the US dollar, or will be mildly affected by that. Next piece of news, BRICS emerges as the world's largest GDP, so gross domestic product bloc, propelled by China's rapid expansion. So compared with the G7, which is the Western countries that traditionally were the strongest financially countries in the world, now the BRICS is the strongest one. So no longer are the Western countries, which include, if I remember well, the US, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and I think I'm missing one other country. They have been replaced by the BRICS, so as the strongest bloc. So it's not that I was telling you that tiny countries, and I'm sorry if you live in one of these countries, but let's say Togo and Nicaragua and the Seychelles Islands joined to create their own currency, that would not cause an impact on the US dollar. But if the largest economically strong bloc in the world is trying to replace the US dollar, that will have an effect on the US dollar and its status as a global reserve currency. Another bit of news, and this is also very recent, China and Russia are working on homegrown alternatives to the SWIFT payment system. So again, guys, if there is no alternative to send money around the world and you need to go through SWIFT, then there's no use of creating your own currency. You're not going to ship that currency in boats or planes. It's going to be a mess. So we do have an alternative, guys, and that is called blockchain. And as you know, you can send US dollars, Bitcoin, or whatnot through the blockchain, and it's instant, and you don't need permission from the US government or from any other government around the world. That already exists. So most surely, China and Russia are working on this Swift alternative using blockchain technologies. So if the way this other currency, the BRICS currency, is going to work, if it's going to work, it needs a Swift alternative, and it's being created as we speak. So potentially, this is going to change things. Now, here's another big piece of news, and it's really recent. Saudi Arabia considers accepting yuan instead of dollars for Chinese oil sales. So this is currently only for trade with China. But Saudi Arabia traditionally was aligned with the US. Now, if they accept yuan, the US is going to be very angry with Saudi Arabia. And we know what are the alternatives that the US usually uses to protect their interests. So sanctions and the military. But we see the balance of the world changing. So will the US sanction Saudi Arabia if they trade in yuan with China? That's a big question. So this is not something that is written in stone. The chessboard is still has a lot of pieces to be moved. China and Russia are the main players, along with the US and the Eurozone. But they have an upper hand right now. Now, this map I wanted to show you because that explains, is Saudi Arabia strong enough to move the needle? Well, these are the biggest oil exporter in the world. And we already spoke how Russia is a strong player. Well, see how large is Saudi Arabia compared to Russia in terms of exporting oil. It's huge, it's massive, guys. Same thing as Iran. Iran doesn't align with the US, and they are actually trying to get into this BRICS system. So you have Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. If you add them together, and they're maybe I would add Libya, they are not the friendliest with the US. So if you add those together, they will have an impact on the US dollar. Now, will this happen? Let's explore some more. What could affect the US dollar's reserve status? One, CIPS, which is the Chinese International Payment System, the alternative to SWIFT, along with the yuan adoption, needs to be embraced by other countries. So if they create their SWIFT alternative, will other countries use it as opposed to using the SWIFT system? Now, the SWIFT system is old, it's clunky, and now the Fed is working on something called the Fed Now, which is also based in blockchain. I love blockchain. If it's adopted by other countries, then it's going to be a hard hit for the US dollar and the US economy in general. The question is, can China be trusted? That is a good, strong question. So China is a communist state. Would you trade your dollars or your currency and save them in yuan? You personally, I'm not sure I would, because I don't know. It's communist systems are basically dictated by one person and by the interests that person think are important. So would that person consider the safety of my country, my currency, and my personal savings? Probably not. So China needs to do something to make other countries adopt the yuan and its own payment system. Remember, we talked about trust early on in this presentation? Well, that needs to happen. So far, China hasn't demonstrated to be the most trustworthy country in the world, but they do apply pressure economically. So a lot of countries in Africa have been invested by China. Also, same thing in South America. So those countries might receive pressure, financial pressure, to switch to this payment system and to the yuan. How will, another question, the US defend its status? So again, they have two main tools, the sanctions and military intervention. But guys, the world today is not the same as the world in the 1970s. The US is no longer the strongest, well, it's still the strongest military and the strongest currency and the strongest economy, but it's being balanced out. We already spoke about the bloc, the BRICS bloc. So would the US invade China? I'm not so sure, guys. Would the US invade Russia? Russia has nuclear weapons. I'm not so sure, guys. Would the US invade India? Well, India is a big trading partner. So pretty much I think they wouldn't. Would the US invade Brazil? That's a big mess because Brazil is part of Latin America and Mexico is the biggest trade partner of the US. And currently the Mexican president looks south. So Mexico would probably not be happy, and that would damage the commerce between Mexico and Brazil and the US and many countries because Brazil is in good standing in the UNO. So I'm not sure. Would the US invade South Africa? Yes, potentially. But South Africa is the weakest link of BRICS. So that's a good question. Would the US issue sanctions to any of these countries? Potentially, but it's easier for the US to issue sanctions for weaker countries that try to adopt the BRICS currency and the Chinese payment system. So let's say Nigeria tries to do this. It would be easier for the US to sanction Nigeria. I think they learned their lesson. You do not sanction a powerful country because it won't work, like it just happened with Russia. If they sanction China, the ball is going to hit them back. So they might be trying this with weaker countries. And that might work or not. We shall see. So if the US lost its reserve status, are we any close to that happening? When could this happening? Before we go to 9, when could this happen? Well, it's happening right now. The world is trying to find balance and trying to find alternatives to the dollar and to Swift and to oil being paid in US dollars. Now, the US at the same time is trying to push alternative energies. So that would take power away from Saudi Arabia, from Russia, from Venezuela. So the more countries that adopt these alternative energies, the least power that those other countries that are aligning to the other side of the world would have. So, and of course, then we have the World Economic Forum behind this, and you start to understand how they play into this new world. When could this happen? It's happening right now. But again, the chessboard is being played and chess pieces are being moved. It's not entirely clear what would happen, but we have two strong players. And by two strong players, I mean two blocks. So what are the consequences if this happens, if the dollar loses its reserve status? Okay, and I mean for you, for your country, for me, and for everyone involved. One, the US dollars would keep losing the purchasing power. For the US, people living in the US, the consequence would be you are going to be able to buy less with your dollars. So now you're seeing this happening already. The US dollar has lost its purchasing power compared to Bitcoin, for example. But internally, this has been going on. If you're not in the US dollar and your country has a lot of reserves in US dollars, your US dollars reserves are going to be devalued along with the US dollar. These are the countries that have the largest reserves of US dollars. I mean, the largest foreign currency reserves, but we already know that 60% of those reserves are denominated in US dollars. So here we can easily see who would suffer the most. Ironically, China, South Korea, Japan, Switzerland, Mexico, Brazil. So you see BRICS here, Saudi Arabia. So those are the countries that would suffer the most if the US is dropped as a reserve currencies, unless they manage to substitute the US dollars with a strong thing, with a strong currency or a strong asset that backs that BRICS currency. And that might take some time. Now, some countries will never switch or potentially will never switch to that other currency and other payment systems, such as Canada. I mean, we have NAFTA or whatever it's called these days. Potentially NASDAQ, Canada and Mexico will not align with the BRICS payment system. Same thing with the UK, Switzerland, France, Spain. Spain might align a little bit with China. They're already trading a lot with China. Italy, we don't know. Germany, we would think that they would not align with Russia and China and those BRICS systems, but they are depending on energy. And if the energy companies are moving that way, Germany could potentially move that way too. So there's a lot of geopolitics. It's very interesting, guys. What would happen? Another consequence, US imports would become more expensive. So if the US dollar loses its strength, things being imported to the US, which is a lot of things, guys, will become more expensive. So the people living in the US will have to pay more for things imported, which is most of the things they buy and sell. In opposition, US exports are going to be cheaper in some countries. So if you export things in some countries, if you are one of these countries that have reserves in a better currency, then your currency is going to be stronger and you're going to be receiving more dollars per export, which in the short term might be a good idea. In the long term, I'm not sure, because your exports are going to become more expensive and then you're going to sell less. Then we have this piece of news. And this is kind of old, but it's still valid today. The collision of these three geographies is creating a new world order. This is published by the World Economic Forum. They have been predicting or planning or working on this for a while. And these three geographies, they basically mean Russia, China, along with the BRICS and the Western countries, and basically everyone else. So they're already talking about the new world order. This is not new. And it's just that the term new world order is kind of mixed into conspiracy theories. But the World Economic Forum, which represents some of the countries in the West, are already predicting this. Now, one of the last things I want to discuss, Ray Dalio, which is the director of one of the largest hedge funds in the world, did a really, really interesting study of these cycles where a currency is adopted as a world reserve currency and then eventually loses that status. And we see that it starts with the New World Order. It starts there, and by that I mean like the one that was signed in 1944 and the Bretton Woods Agreement. In this case, the latest one was when the world adopted the US dollar. Then there's a period of peace and prosperity and productivity backed by this world order. Then we start seeing a financial bubble, which is happening now, and a big wealth gap where the richer become richer and the poorer become poorer. We already saw that. Then there's a financial bust and economic downturn. We're kind of seeing that right now, guys. Isn't that true in the US? Then they try to compensate for this, trying to save the system. They start printing money and issuing loans. And we are seeing in the US right now printing and printing and printing a lot of money. So are we here? Yes, we are here. Then that usually devolves into revolution and wars. That we have not seen yet. Hopefully, we are far from that. But it could happen, guys. It has happened with the UK, with Spain, with the Netherlands, and all other countries that had at some point become a reserve status. Then they issue more debt and they try to restructure politically, and they kind of fail doing that. And in the meantime, another country has been working their way up and becoming a new dominating country, and their currency becoming dominating. And that creates a new world order again. And I think we are close to that. Lastly, if you're interested in this and trying to figure this out, Ray Dalio published a book. It's called The Changing World Order. And in this book, he explains basically how all of this works. So guys, it was a long video, but there's a lot of information to cover. It's really interesting, and it might change the way we live, the way we buy, we sell things, the way your company employs you, pays you, and everything in your and my economy and the economy of the people around the world. So it's important to pay attention. I hope this video was useful, was interesting. And if it was, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel to get more information about how to thrive in an environment like this. For the time being, see you in the next video. Bye-bye now.